Please join me in welcoming our first leader in residence, Michael Ridley.
What I want to talk to you about is failure and ignorance, because I think that's the seat of all progress. And I'll walk you through that. And I know that for lots of people, when we think about failure and ignorance, it's a bad thing. It's something that is we try to avoid in lots of ways, or we don't certainly acknowledge. I guess I want to turn that frown around, and I want to actually explore the good side of failure and ignorance and how that works, and why I think we should view it differently. And I'll talk a little bit about that. It occurred to me, though, that I'm speaking at a public library, and I'm an academic librarian, a CIO. I've been an academic librarian pretty much all my life. So where's the street cred that I have for you folks? What can I tell you something, why would you even listen to me coming from the background I am? So I thought I'd better establish a little bit of street cred here so that I seem a credible person. That guy there is me at the Fredericton Public Library doing, one of those events we do in the children's library. That's the wonderful Mary Mayo in the side here, who's running this Alice in Wonderland event. It's me in the children's department. I worked for a year in the Fredericton Public Library before I went to library school. I do want you to know that it says 1976, not 1876. I think it's important that you try and frame my experience appropriately. So I have sort of been there, I have sort of done it, and I sort of do have the t-shirt as far as public libraries. It was a wonderful experience working in the Fredericton Public Library. They let me do everything, including drive the bookmobile, which was very cool. I had fun with that. You still have bookmobiles? No, not anymore, eh? Okay, that was very cool. The other thing that Pam mentioned is that it's Halloween, and I see some very unusual people in the audience. I'm assuming they don't always come to work this way. And she thought, why didn't I come dressed up? So I thought I'd better at least acknowledge the fact that I can behave differently. This is me during a United Way appeal campaign. We have something called the Everyday Hero costume, and I agreed to put it on for a day and walk around like that. And I'll come back and explain why that's not such a good thing. It's a very hot costume. It was unbelievably difficult to wear for the whole day. However, back to where we really want to be, which is failure. Failure really has gone viral these days. Everybody seems to be talking about failure. The point that I want to make is not enough people are doing it. We need to see a lot more failure, and that's what I'll talk about. Anybody been to a fail camp? Anybody know what a fail camp is? Oh, these are really cool. If you ever get a chance to go to one, I highly recommend them. I went to one at the Internet Librarian recently that was run by Amy Buckland from McGill, and Kim Silk from U of T was involved, and a number of other people. And basically, they had people get up and tell their failure stories. What went wrong, what they did that didn't work out, how they made mistakes. And they were very upfront, very honest, and very clear about it. And what was most cool about the session was, at the end, they invited people from the audience to declare their failures. And at first nobody did a thing, and then someone put up their hand a little bit, and they started to talk about something that went wrong or didn't work out. And eventually it turned into a revival meeting. There were people standing up and declaiming their failures, and I have failed and I am proud of it, this sort of thing. And it went on like this, and it was just so cathartic and refreshing to have people do that, and to do that in a way that was positive and helpful to everybody else, because we've all been there, done that. We've all had that problem. We all saw the positive nature of the problems, but also the positive nature of putting those issues in a much more public forum. And so, failure really is a useful tool. How many people play Angry Birds? How many people aren't putting up their hand because they don't want to be seen to be playing Angry Birds? That's all the rest of you, I suspect. Angry Birds, phenomenal success, right? This is just unbelievable how this thing has swept the internet. The company that did Angry Birds, has built Angry Birds, built 51 other games that flopped before they got Angry Birds launched. So huge amount of failure before their overnight success with Angry Birds. So it's important to see the continuity and the context for failure. And this is why it matters. This, for me, is why I care about this, why I think you should care about it. If failure truly is the crucible of learning, how do we nurture the risk-taking that's necessary for innovation and change? I link failure to understanding, learning, advancing, and we need that in order to be innovative, to change, to move our organizations forward, to move our libraries forward. So failure and risk-taking go together, and they're critical if we're going to see ideas in a new way. We're going to develop services in a new day. We're going to respond to our users in a very different and positive way. We've really got to see that connection between failure and learning. And it's something that lots of people have commented on over the years. So one of my favorite writers, Samuel Beckett, said it, I think, quite eloquently. Try again, fail better. Failing better is his goal as a writer. Getting closer, getting near to that goal. Knowing you're going to fail, but at least fail in a way that advances things. One of my other favorite philosophers has said something quite similar. Trying is the first step towards failure. And of course, in Homer's case, he wouldn't even bother to try. But it is true that getting out there is that first initial step, and it's important to make that step. So I guess what I really want to talk about is failure and ignorance. That's sort of the theme of the presentation, and I hope the theme of what we can talk about afterwards as well. And if you have you're supposed to have a takeaway message as a speaker always, something that you can walk out of this room and say, that's what Ridley talked about. So here's what you can say afterwards about this talk. This is my message to you. Screw up and act like a total idiot. I actually think that's a useful instruction for you. I think that's actually helpful in terms of a perspective, and I'll come and explain why I think that's good and why I would encourage you to do this. You have my permission. The reason is things are dramatically changing. We're working in a sector, in libraries, public libraries, academic libraries, whatever, in a sector where things are dramatically different. And this particular reference, I think, frames it for me very well. When simple change becomes transformational change, the desire for continuity becomes a dysfunctional mirage. If we live in times of transformational change, which I would argue we are absolutely in, and I don't think we've seen anything yet, I think we're in the early days of that, then try to connect the dots to the past. Trying to link what we're doing now with something in the past isn't going to work. It's not going to be helpful. It's not going to be useful. So we've got to think of this as a disjointed connection, something that's going to take us in a different direction. Maybe build on some values and some traditions, yes, but not expect to find those direct connections to the past in the same way that we have before. We're going to have to map out some new territory here. That's going to be difficult. That might be even painful. And we all know how it works. If you think about risk and innovation, we assume that if we can risk something, we'll get innovation, and the hope is you'll get something like this happening. The more you risk, the more innovation you get. The more innovation you get, you may have to take some more risks to do that. And there's a correlation there, which is important. Probably all of you really know that it looks more like that it's kind of back and forth and never quite gets exactly in a straight line, and you have some setbacks. I guess I'm here to tell you that this is what it really looks like. And this is a good thing. This kind of chaos is okay. It is where great ideas come from. Not from the predictable one-step, two-step, but from the madness that kind of represents. That's where innovation comes from. That's where you're at the leading edge, the bleeding edge even, and it's very fruitful. So I thought I'd invoke Stephen Abram. How many people have seen Stephen do a talk? Quite a few of you, good, excellent. It seems to me Stephen, I love Stephen, and one of the things he's wonderfully useful for is to kind of provide some context about where libraries are and where libraries are going, and he does lots of talks about that. So I thought I'd just dip into a little bit of his talks to try and set the frame on, what are the issues that libraries are facing, and then we'll delve into the details. So just a few slides from Stephen. Okay. So that's about as fast as Stephen normally goes anyway, so I'm sure you caught all that, and you get a sense of what we're facing and why. But here's what I think libraries are really about. And at the end, I've distilled it down to two things that I think we need to do, in fact, have always done, and need to think of going forward. So if there is some continuity in where I want to go, it's in these two ideas. Libraries, or the work that we do, the work we do in our profession, the work we do in our organizations, really are, on one hand, to create a coherence framework, a way for people to understand things, a way for them to make sense of what's going on in the world, in their lives, in what they care about. It's that coherence they're looking for. How do I put that together in some reasonable way? It's an incredibly important objective, and that one we obviously carry forward in lots of ways. At the same time, though, I think an important part of what we do is this idea of being a dissonance engine, a way of confronting people and challenging people with ideas and perspectives and ways of thinking that they haven't been prepared for, that they're not expecting, that maybe jolt them out of what they're thinking about, that expand their frames of reference. Coherence and dissonance have to work together to create that tension between what I need to know and what I also need to know but I'm not aware of. I'm not aware that I need to know that sort of thing. It has to have that balance. So I think at the end of the day, the jobs that we have, the focus that we need is to do both these things, to help people by giving them tools and resources that allow them to create that coherence, but also tools and resources that in a sense shock them a little bit, that move them off the place they're at right now into maybe another space or another perspective or another view. And those two things, I think, are enormously important. And think about that as we talk about what it means to risk and where that risk would come from. So what are the keys to success? What do we need to do that would make a difference? Well, the very first thing for me is to remember what Peter Drucker said, which I think is enormously helpful, and that is, culture eats strategy for breakfast. As much as we plan things, we have wonderful strategic plans or ideas or concepts or projects, what really changes the world, what really changes the way we work in our organizations is the culture that's nurtured, the way that we work together as individuals, the way that we work with our communities. That culture is really the vehicle for change and transformation. And it truly does eat lunch of the strategies that we think are useful. So focus and think about culture as the nub of this and how that might change. I'm going to use a small example here from the academic world because it's relevant to my world and maybe relevant to yours too. My favorite observation about the world that I live in, the academic world, is this from Clark Kerr. I have sometimes thought of the university as a series of individual faculty entrepreneurs held together by a common grievance over parking. And if any of you have ever been involved in labor negotiations at the academic level, you'll know that the very first thing that comes up in any collective agreement discussion is how much is the parking going to cost and where can priority parking be for the faculty? But what this really demonstrates for me, and what's really important, is we are dealing with individuals who have their own needs and desires and objectives, and they're not necessarily aligned along with what we want. They've got all sorts of different ideas that they want to move forward, and we have to find a way to connect with them in some fashion. So despite the somewhat negative tone here, it's actually a positive message about the nature of a community and understanding that community and where they come from. So at the end of the day, we want people to take risks, to be innovative, to stretch in some way. And that seems like a normal thing. That seems like a kind of a no-brainer. What's the problem here? And I guess the problem is there are barriers to this. There are things that aren't allowing this to happen in organizations. And I want to explore a little bit of what those barriers are. What's holding us back from having that kind of a culture? Why are we, generally speaking, in risk-averse cultures? Where do those things come from? I think there are a number of barriers. And these are just some of them in terms of how we think about peer pressure, financial constraints that are on our organizations and ourselves, traditions and history that weigh heavily on what we do and how we do it. We've always done it this way, or it's always worked, why change it? But also things like career advancement. It's not always good to be the outlier. It's not always good to be the person that's doing something quite different that people are a little curious about and wondering why you're doing that or doing something that isn't working, in fact, when obviously what we should be doing is things that are successful in some way. But I think there's another big piece of the barrier that's very significant that I want to talk about, and that's me. I think I'm a big barrier to this sort of risk-taking and innovation. I think people in senior leadership positions, chief librarians, university librarians, people who have those kinds of roles, are often very adverse to risk. They actually talk a lot about risk and how it's important to take it, and then their actions actually suggest that they behave quite differently. we tend to be very conservative. We tend to be afraid to upset the apple cart. We tend to not want to allow people to spend some resources, to get into a little bit of trouble, to maybe embarrass the organization in some fashion. And as a result, I think the single biggest barrier probably is leadership. And that leadership really needs to move off of that space in a much more dramatic way. I think the staff that are around us are often far more adventurous, far more risk-taking than we are, and there's an inherent tension there that needs to be resolved in some fashion. So certainly one of the big barriers, I think, are people like me. I think people who are in the positions that really need to open up that opportunity in a much more dramatic way. I think there's another one, though, another barrier that is equally problematic and related, and that's simply orthodoxy. We got a lot of library baggage we're bringing around, and that baggage is causing us to think certain ways, do certain things. And you know what? In a time of transformational change, you got to leave that baggage at the door. It's stuff that isn't working for us anymore, or it's not working the way it used to, and it gets reinforced in those traditions and that history. It gets reinforced, in my mind, in some of the things you're seeing now where librarians and libraries are kind of digging in their heels and saying, nope, we're not going to go further anymore. We've gone too far. We gotta reclaim the past a little bit, reclaim the position we had before, and that'll be more effective. I really see this happening, since I'm closer to it, in the academic library world, where there's a tremendous groundswell of resistance to a lot of things that are going on in research libraries and academic libraries. And it's almost a kind of a rear view mirror thinking about moving forward. It's very discouraging, and I think it's happening in other sectors as well. We're kind of clinging to something and we are clinging to that something because it was from a time where things were a bit easier, where it was a time when we kind of knew what our roles were, we knew how we fit into our communities or to our responsibilities. And as things have shifted and the sand has changed a lot underneath us, we're beginning to feel so uncomfortable that rather than move into that territory, rather than explore that territory in a positive and engaged way, we're kind of retreating a little bit. And we're saying, let's go back to a simpler time a little bit. Let's go back to somewhere we had solid footing, and then we'll move forward. I don't think that's a winning strategy. I don't think it's a winning strategy to really move into the space where we can be tremendously valuable to our communities. We're backing away from a challenge rather than fully engaging in that challenge. And we're wrapping it in this orthodoxy of how we've done things and how important that is. So I would say that one of the things as a profession, as library workers, as libraries, we've got to really examine those assumptions that we bring to the table. Lots of them, in my mind, aren't that valid anymore. Lots of them need to be overturned. And maybe even more importantly, there's whole new territories out there that we can move into, that we can be helpful in if we were to risk going into that space. If we were to not so much worry about, is this what libraries do? Is this what librarians do? Is this what I should be doing as a worker? Rather, it's here's somewhere where we can be useful and helpful. And one of the things that I think is important there is we bring a kind of a value system to the table. My coherence and dissonance framework, I think, that is actually tremendously useful in those spaces, in those new areas, in that groundbreaking pioneer space. So I really do think we have to do it. And in order to do that, my other mantra is this: ignorance is bliss. If you don't know where you're going, woohoo, this is good. You don't have any assumptions, you're not predisposed to think one way or the other. You're going in there with a very open mind about this. So ignorance in the sense of, I really don't know enough about this to make a judgment call. I want to explore it more. I want to learn more. Librarians are actually, here's a phrase I'll never repeat in public again, naturally ignorant. And I mean that in the sense that we're always really curious about things. So we're always looking into spaces where we really don't have a solid footing as we might want. But that's part of the excitement about what we do. We're trying to learn more about things and bring that into a library perspective or setting in some way. So I think that willingness to have an open mind, that willingness to explore things is really a tremendous asset going forward. It will help us. So what are the key solutions here? Well, I have three for you, three suggestions on how you can practically move this forward. How do we move from a risk-averse organization or a risk-averse profession or a risk-averse set of responsibilities and actually change the culture, change that attitude. The first one is you have to out yourself. You have to out yourself as a failure. It's so important for particularly people like me to proclaim that. So a number of years ago, I wrote an article for our student newspaper. It was actually a column that I write every couple of weeks for the paper. I've been doing this for a number of years. And this particular one was titled, "My Name is Mike and I'm a Failure." And one of the quotes was, "I'm a serial failure and quite proud of it." So the whole article really talks about how I screw up a lot, and that screwing up is the thing that enables me and the library and the IT environment to see things differently and to see things in a more positive way. So the very first thing is to demonstrate to other people that you also fail and that those failures were beneficial in terms of other things. If leadership, if senior folks aren't willing to do that, it's never going to happen from any other place. So I'm a failure, proud of it. I did also want to make a distinction, though, between failure and mistakes, because I think there really is a big difference here. It was a mistake to use this picture, for example. But there were other examples of maybe mistakes that I can show you the difference, and I think it is critical. So a mistake and a failure from my own experience. My mistake was erasing the library's database one day. I'm not talking about just one copy of the library's database. I'm talking about the only copy of the library's database. I was a systems analyst at Guelph a long time ago, and I worked in the IT department, and one particular project we were on, we had to move our database from one set of drives to another. And these were when, I know this is going to sound terrible, but these are when drives were these big bathtub sorts of things, you know. You look in the 1876 stuff and you'll find it, I'm sure. But they were very cumbersome things and very difficult to do, and we had to move them from one to the other. And we literally, this was when we had big databases, when we thought a gigabyte was like a ginormous database. And we had to move it from one set of drives to another set of drives, and there was no way we could back it up. We had to do it live. We had to do it at one time. And so that was my job. And I screwed up. I deleted the database. There was gone, absolutely gone. And so I'm thinking, well, this was pretty much a career-limiting decision here to do this. And amazingly enough, I worked with an amazing guy named George Loney, who was my boss at the time. And George said, "Mike, go home. We'll think about this tomorrow." You know, we were going to be down for a couple of days anyway. We'll talk about it tomorrow morning. So I went home and didn't sleep. Came back the next morning, and George had figured it out. George literally went into the drives, and you probably all know that there's a directory in a drive, a little place where it tells you where the data actually is. And he literally, address at a time, replaced the addresses which had been destroyed with the addresses of where the data actually was, and recreated on the disk where the data was. And it all came back, because the addresses were restored. So he undid the delete, essentially. And that's the only reason why I'm the chief librarian now, by the way, because I really should have been fired for that. That was a huge mistake. That was, in a sense, incompetence. So mistakes are bad. Don't make mistakes. But do fail. And one of my failures was around something called expert systems. Anybody remember expert systems? These were very big a number of years ago. It came out of the artificial intelligence environment, and the idea was we'd build these systems that were essentially able to answer questions. It's not unlike what the iPhone 4S is doing right now with Siri, but the idea is we would use these as a way of augmenting our reference service. And we'd build in these knowledge engines, and we'd be able to allow people to interact with them and find out information. It'd be very useful and skilled. So I was working at a health sciences library at the time, and there's a lot of interest in this sort of thing around clinical systems as well as library systems that would take advantage of this sort of AI technology. So we spent, I would say a year and a half at least, intensive discussions, huge amount of money spent on software and training, lots of work with the reference staff to try to do this, and we got absolutely nothing out of it. It was a disaster. The stuff never worked. It didn't do what we expected it to do. It didn't perform anything like the level that we expected it to, and we killed the project after spending a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of angst. Huge failure, but huge success. We learn more about how we do reference, the kinds of assumptions we make about what kinds of questions come forward, how we're interacting with our user community, whether they're students or clinicians or what have you. So the spin-off benefit, tremendous spin-off benefit was, we didn't build an expert system, but we had a much deeper, richer understanding of our reference abilities and how we can improve those in a face-to-face mode or in other modes. So it was a failure. It took a huge amount of time and effort, but in fact, it turned out to be very positive for us in lots of ways. So, first thing is, out yourself. Second thing is, change the organization. And I don't really mean change the organization, I mean nurture the organization. We really have to think about our spaces, our workplaces in a different way if we want to encourage risk, if we want to generate that kind of innovation. And that means having organizations that actually behave differently. And I'll tell you a story that for me was kind of the nub of it for Guelph. I was once overheard one of our librarians say this. He didn't realize I was nearby. And it kind of shocked me to the core. You can't innovate in this library. This is one of our librarians who was relatively new, someone I had a lot of respect for. And he wasn't finding the space to do what he wanted to do in what I thought was a pretty advanced library. I was pretty chuffed about what we did. And it turns out, maybe not so much. Maybe there were issues here that we need to deal with. So we went forward and started to do what turned out to be a 4-year project to completely renew the library from the ground up. Lots of people I tell that we did this because we really needed to allocate our resources more effectively. There were challenges that we needed to respond to, and that's kind of the official party line. The truth is, we went through this 4 years. I wanted to launch this process because of that phrase, because we had staff who no longer saw the library as a vehicle for innovation. It had become unorthodox. It had become a place where only certain things were allowed to be discussed. So we did, in fact, launch this huge organizational renewal process. It's still going on. But a big foundational piece for that reorganization is questioning what we've done, doing things differently, jettisoning those things that don't have value, creating teams that are going to work together differently, creating different work groups entirely that will work differently, and then seeing how we can evolve with those very different assumptions. We questioned everything. We went back to the absolute grassroots and have gradually built it up from there. It's taken a long time. It's a huge commitment for the library and for the university. But at the end of the day, it is where we got the engagement we need to give people the freedom to do things differently. And we have a very, very different organization as a result of all that. So my third advice to you is chill out. Because if you do the first two things, good stuff will happen. You will have nurtured that culture where things will happen. And that's the good side of this. So I walked into the library a while ago, and there were these signs all over the place, like this. And I'm going, what's going on? I had no idea what this was about. I had no idea what an innovation boot camp was. I didn't even know who was doing it. It just said, show up at these sessions on these days. Everybody was welcome, and there was a place. So you go, right? What's going on here? What's happening? And when you went to the room where this was being held, this is who met you. Corporal Robin, and she was a recruiting officer for the boot camp. And she was explaining to you that you were a possible inductee into the boot camp, and you were coming for an information session, and she'd be willing to give you a little packet of information, and you'd sit down in the room and you'd learn from the recruiting officer about what this boot camp was and why you might want to be involved in the innovation boot camp. She did this with an entire straight face for about an hour. It was absolutely awesome. Nobody asked permission to do this. Nobody explained what was going on. She just decided that we needed to have one of these things. So what they actually did was run a pilot with 6 people to help them learn to be more innovative and creative. The boot camp idea was, let's learn to be different. Let's learn to think differently, to try things, to explore things, and see what happens. And these folks are from all different parts of the library. They all applied to be part of the boot camp, and they were chosen for a variety of reasons. I have no idea how they were chosen. I certainly had nothing to do with it. There's librarians here, there's some interns, there are some of our support staff, there's even a student here as part of this group, so it's a pretty big mix. And what they did for the next little while, oh, by the way, that's MJ. Some of you may know MJ. He and Robin are the ringleaders behind this, and I'll come and tell you a little bit more what they're up to in other ways. They just started to do some very interesting things together. They met once a week for 2 hours. I think they did this for something like 12 weeks. And they explored different parts of innovation, creativity, and ideas. And the really cool thing about this was not only did they get incredibly energized by this, but they took it back to the areas where they worked and told everybody what they were doing and how cool it was and what they could do. And so it went viral within the organization, and everybody ended up getting to benefit. So they did strange building things, and they wrote things, and I just can't imagine what they did. It was quite bizarre. But this camp has now evolved into other groups in the library. MJ and Robin Burkhardt is her name, MJ Dahlia is the other individual. Robin and MJ have taken this on the road and have done this at various conferences. They've done this for different kinds of groups. And it's a very simple technique of having people really think at their work differently and think about their attitudes and assumptions differently. It liberates people into being more creative, being more of a risk taker. The reason I highlight this for you, though, is what's important for me about this was it just happened. It just evolved in the library. All of a sudden, the posters were there. All of a sudden, Robin's dressed up in her get-up, and MJ's there in the same way. And they've decided to take that risk. They've decided to do something which is something they're interested in, but positive for the organization as well. If I just chilled out, good stuff will happen. And sure enough, it did. Those folks rose to that challenge and have utterly changed the way the library thinks about professional development or staff development. We don't do lectures anymore. We don't do that sort of stuff because they want to do this. They want to get involved. They want to participate. They want to stretch in some way. And lots of other events have happened as a result of this, which are very similar and have that same sort of attitude. So the bottom line for me is that risk and innovation are absolutely critical. And there are things we can learn from this and apply, I guess. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with this book, The Future of Management, Gary Hamel. It's an absolute amazing book. One of the best books on management that I know, and management in the sense of management and leadership, I guess. And the reason I like it is that it brings the idea of creativity into the confines, into the area of management. It thinks about creativity as an important component of what it means to be a manager, what it means to be an organization. And creativity is something we often push out of organizations. He's very strong on this, as well as other very practical things as well. Fabulous book. This is one of the observations which I think is very true for us. Organizations don't miss the future because it's unpredictable, but because it's unpalatable. We push things off the table because we don't like where that's going, as opposed to we need to think about the fact that it is happening. So we ignore some important aspects of our future because it's too risky or it's challenging things that we'd rather not have challenged. And that can lead us to ignore important directions. So Hamel's advice is really fourfold. First of all, treat every belief as a hypothesis. Assume that whatever you have may not be true going forward. It needs to be tested. You need to really think more deeply about it. Find those dissidents and critics. Find the people who are actually unhappy or dislocated or are challenging around some of these ideas, because deep in what they're telling you is something you need to hear, something that's out of shape, or it's not working properly, or there's a gap or a dissonance there somehow. So those dissidents and those critics are really, really valuable people, whether they're in your organization or out of your organization. Spend the time at the bleeding edge. The bleeding edge is a tough place to be, but it is where we're learning things. And if we can learn and mitigate the consequences of screwing up, then that bleeding edge is a wonderful space to be in. It's sharp and it's pointy and you get stabbed, but it's exhilarating at the same time if we're willing to give ourselves a little bit of relax a little bit, I guess. And then finally, for me, the most important, imagine the unimaginable. Think about things that could be very different and could be explored in different ways or could happen perhaps. Not just unimaginable in the sense of bad stuff, but unimaginable in the sense of, wow, we could go somewhere really cool if we did this, and that would be dramatically different. So I encourage you to go out there and fail. I encourage you to go out there and screw up big time, because I think it is only in doing that that we'll find that creativity, we'll find that innovation going forward, and that what we do in terms of libraries and information spaces will evolve into that new territory, that pioneering territory that I talked about earlier, which I really do believe is our future. Thank you very much.